All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us for this presentation where we're going to learn about Motus, what Motus is, how it's used, how it impacts conservation, and one of the recent projects that our state ornithologist, Allie, who's here with us today, is currently working on with her team, which is the Wood Thrush program or project that they're doing, which is really, really cool. I'm super excited to learn about Motus. It's an incredible research tool that we have at our disposal, and it's a great way for us to connect with conservation partners all across the country and internationally even. Before we jump right into the good stuff, I wanted to do just a couple housekeeping things. First off, I'm Mariah Mason. I'm an outreach specialist here at the Division of Fish and Wildlife. Alexandra Hicks, my counterpart, is going to be co-hosting. She'll be helping out with the Q&A and some tech stuff on the back end. So thank you so much, Alexandra. And our expert tonight is Allisyn Gillet, who is our state ornithologist. So she will get on in just a minute, and I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more. But before we do that, just a couple things about Teams in case you haven't used Teams before. This event is being recorded, but we cannot see your face. We can't hear anything that's going on with you. The only kind of thing that we can interact is through the Q&A platform. So please use the Q&A. We will have time at the end of this presentation for Allie to answer all of your questions. So please use that at any point throughout the event, and we will get to those at the end. If there are questions that we don't get to tonight, if we run out of time, we will be sending out a post-event email with all of the resources that we share during this event and all of the questions we didn't get to. So you'll still get the chance to have those answered. And then another thing about Teams Live is that there is a closed caption feature. So if you prefer to have auto-generated closed captions on the screen, you can find that in the settings and turn that on to help out in that way if that's desirable. And the recording, once we have it ready to go, will go on YouTube within the next couple of weeks. So y'all can look out for that. But aside from that, I am going to go ahead and turn things over to our guest of honor, Allie. Thanks so much for taking time to be here. You can introduce yourself and then jump right into the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mariah, for that nice introduction. Just to give you, again, a little bit of background about myself, I am Allisyn Gillet. I am the state ornithologist for the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. And specifically what that means is that I'm a wildlife biologist that focuses on birds. And I will be talking to you a little bit about the Motus network. But before we jump into that, I wanted to give you a little bit more of an idea of what I actually do with my program at the DNR. So the main responsibilities that I have for the ornithology program or the bird program is that I specifically work to survey for state listed species. That means the species that are considered state endangered or of special concern, so protected by law in the state of Indiana. And this means that it could include species as charismatic as the barn owl, as you can see here. Here's a lovely group of young barn owls in a nest box. There are really cool grassland bird, nocturnal raptor that really we have a lot of interesting programs going on with them where we actually install barn owl boxes throughout the state, and we have installed more than 350 boxes throughout the state since the 1980s. So it's really a strong program, and the barn owl population is doing pretty well. And then we cover other species that are a little less charismatic, perhaps, like this loggerhead shrike here. That's our little, it's a bird that looks very much like a mockingbird, but expresses a lot of the behavioral traits of a raptor, which is really cool. They're also called the butcher bird, and they share pretty similar habitats to barn owls, but they are a pretty niche type of bird that requires a lot of unique aspects of their habitat with like pastures and livestock in the area, as well as barbed wire, because they do this really interesting behavior of impaling their prey on barbed wire fences or anything sharp, honestly. So, and that could include insects or rodents, other birds. So they're little raptor that's kind of, they're not a raptor, they are very much like a raptor, but like in the body of a mockingbird, which is cool. So we only have about, I'd say, fewer than 10 breeding pairs that we know of throughout the state annually. And so my responsibility with my program is to be able to conserve these species that are listed as endangered again, or of special concern. And what that entails is surveying for them, knowing exactly where they occur, how abundant they are, how those populations are faring over time, and if they are declining, then I have to figure out, hey, you know, we have to do research to figure out exactly why they're declining, what's threatening them overall. And then once we do that research, try to really divulge and like discover what those threats are, then we have the ability to manage them and try to mitigate those threats, try to make them become less of a threat to those species so that they can survive and reproduce successfully, so that their populations would ultimately stabilize or become greater over time. So that's ideal situation, would be those populations really increasing over time, like our loggerhead shrike. So it'd be really nice to see them be more abundant throughout the state of Indiana. But for now, we're really focusing on just kind of keeping them in Indiana. So that's what I do. And where Motus really fits into all of this is the research piece. So let's get started with Motus. So Motus is a big network. It's a wildlife tracking network that it's been around since the 2010s, I'd say, and it's really revolutionized kind of the way that we track wildlife. But first and foremost, like, why do we track wildlife? Why do we want to even know where they're going? Well, first, we need to see where they're going to understand, like, what habitats are they using? How are they interacting with their environments? And you need to know specifically where they go, especially if they are a species that is declining, because by knowing exactly those locations, you can see what's happening in those locations where they, for example, nest, or they stop over, or where they winter throughout their full cycle, throughout their full lives. And once you really figure that out, you can see, like, is there some sort of threat that's occurring? Perhaps if you have like the barn owl and you're tracking them throughout its full life, and you're seeing it go to a wintering ground that might be, you know, grasslands that were once intact being completely developed into housing projects. So you can really start seeing like what is threatening those animals, so then be able to figure out ways to actually conserve them. So we really need to know where they go. And then we also want to track wildlife movements, because we get to learn more about just how they interact with their environments, as well as things like just basic aspects of their biology. So like, when you have a bird that has been tagged with a unique identifier, you can figure out, hey, if I see that bird again, how old it is, because you'll know the first time when you saw how old it was, and then you get that another snap in time of that bird, and you can age it based off of that information. So you can get information on like how it's doing, and then also how well are the species surviving overall. So if you have birds that are specifically, you know, there's a group that's dying, whereas another group is like thriving, you can get an idea of their survival as a population as a whole, to see like, are there certain areas that might be maybe having particular issues where they're perhaps dying more often, and then be able to go in there and conserve those areas. And then again, like I said, we learn about the threats that they face wherever they're traveling. And I really want to emphasize this need for things like full annual cycle conservation. That's full life cycle conservation. With birds, many of them are very migratory. Not all birds are migratory, but there are a pretty large amount of species that are migratory, that go from as far north as, you know, the Arctic of Canada all the way down to Argentina. And that is, if you're not perhaps helping to conserve them throughout that entire path that they take during their lives, your work perhaps, you know, in Canada would have no overall effect on the population as a whole, if you're not actually helping them mitigate any threats in that southern area in Argentina. So it's really important that you have to conserve like the birds throughout its entire life, because if you're neglecting one part, it might overall not have any impact. So like that effort might be not necessarily wasted, but it wouldn't have as big of an impact as you would want it to really help that species survive. So that's what we call full annual cycle conservation or full life cycle conservation. So now we know that, the reason why we choose to track wildlife. We have all these different methods for being able to do so, which is quite amazing, especially with the miniaturization of our technology. There's been major advances to allow us to track birds that are so much smaller. And it's really cool because you can track birds that are like warblers that are just a few grams in size, as well as other wildlife like this dragonfly here that is pretty darn small. You can actually put a tag like this on the back of a dragonfly nowadays. It's been so miniaturized. But before, we used to track birds and other wildlife. They're just uniquely tagging them specifically with perhaps like a ring, a band around their legs that have a unique identifier. Like I like to think of it as like akin to a social security number. Every single bird has a very unique identifier that's associated with just that single individual. And then if you end up capturing that bird again or seeing that bird again through your binoculars and being able to read that whole unique sequence of numbers, you can see like where did that bird come from, where was it when it was originally abandoned, and how old was it, so that you can learn more about that bird throughout its whole life. But now we have these other forms of technology like this. This here is a geolocator on a bobolink, a male bobolink here. It is also a very small tracking device that actually is called an archival tag, meaning that it actually stores the data on that little device here. It does not send information, however, to your computer through a satellite. So it actually requires you to be able to go in and tag that bird, meaning put that tag, the little device, on the bird using a harness. And then once you've gotten on that, you need to go back to the area again the next year and try to recapture the bird so that you can collect the data off of this tag. And that's an archival tag, and that can be really challenging with birds that might not show up exactly in the same location that you were in when you originally tagged that bird. So it can be really challenging for species that don't have what we call like breeding site fidelity. They don't go exactly to the same exact spot year after year to go nest. And when they don't, this type of transmitter does not really work for that species. So there are pros and cons with every type of transmitter. We also have this one here that's a satellite transmitter on an American robin. It's an Argos satellite transmitter. It actually has on, in this little device, it has a GPS, I'd say a little computer in there that can get a GPS location of that bird every day, let's say. It depends on when you choose to program it. And that, because it has this really long antenna, can actually communicate. If you look here, it has these really long antennas that are probably double the length of the bird. It can actually communicate, because that antenna is so long, with a satellite. So it's really convenient, and you can get the data from the satellite to know from the comfort of your own home and your computer. You can actually go online and say, hey, oh wow, my bird is in, let's say, Alaska right now. It was in winter, in Indiana, but now it's in Alaska a few days from now because it migrated. That's really convenient. And so they have become so small to be able to be put on American robins. But the con with this type of technology is it's really expensive. It's super expensive. So it costs thousands of dollars just for this tag, and then you have to get a data plan with the tag that is actually charged monthly. So there are a lot of different aspects about, it's a great tag. You can get all the data from your computer from the satellite, but it costs a lot of money. So if you want to tag a lot of birds, oftentimes we have to do something that's in between, like the convenience of this one versus like the miniaturization of this one. So we have now gotten to a point where we have introduced a thing called a nano tag, and that's what this little tag is. It's about 0.6 to 2 grams in size, super small. And when I think about grams, I think about paper clips. So paper clip is about the size of a gram. That's how much a paper clip weighs. And think about just holding 2 paper clips in your hand. That's how much a tag would weigh, including the harness. So they're really, really small, and they can be put on much smaller birds, like warblers. With a satellite tag, those are too heavy still that they can't be put on small animals like warblers. They're just too heavy. It would imagine just like, think of a warbler having to carry the half of its size on its back. That's a little too much. It wouldn't be able to fly likely because it's just too much weight. So we now have these tags that are nano tags that are longer lasting, they're incredibly light, and they're very affordable too. They're about $250, $260 per pop. And you don't have a data plan associated with that tag. And that brings us to the Motus technology. So nano tags are associated with this thing called the Motus network. And Motus, what that means is movement in Latin. And so that's this whole, I would say, it's a interesting open source type of network where everybody collaborates with each other. I find it to be very much like a grassroots program where a lot of the power is in the collaborative environment of all the scientists and the organizations working together. And what this means is that you have these tags which are communicating with, that are attached to the wildlife, whether it be a bat, an insect like a dragonfly or a monarch butterfly, or a bird like the wood thrush that I'll talk to you about. And those are attached to your animals. And they communicate with these towers, these Motus stations. And all these stations are pretty much scattered throughout North America and South America, and they all function on the same exact frequency, the radio frequency. So these tags, if you think about, when you think about your radio in your car, that's your radio in your car is a receiving device. You tune in on, let's say, 103.5, your favorite radio station, and you say, oh, you can now hear the host of your favorite program coming in and talking to you. That is like the station here. They are like the car that's tuned in to the radio station. And the radio station, however, is this little tag and all the tags collectively on all those wildlife. And these are all tuned to give off frequencies of 166.38. They all give off that same exact frequency, a signal that's at that 166.38 megahertz. So they are talking essentially to these stations, and the stations will pick up whether this tag comes by it. So only wildlife that are tagged will be communicating. So it's not just any animal. They have to have the tag on it. I often get that question. They're like, oh, robin flew by my tower. Did you pick it up? It's like, well, did it have a tag? If it doesn't have a tag, you won't be able to pick it up. So, so you might be thinking, hey, okay, so if they're all tuned in to the same, they're all giving off the same exact frequency, they're all giving off the same exact signal, how do you tell them apart? Like, how do you tell this robin from a bat, an evening bat, for example? Well, the way that they make each tag unique to that animal is that they have a unique pulse pattern that's associated with the tag. So it will give off the same frequency, but it'll give a pulse, which is like a beep kind of sound, kind of akin to what I think of as like Morse code. It'll give a series of 4 pulses. Let's say beep, 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 beep would be one bird, whereas another bird might be beep, 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 beep. And there will be another bird that's beep, 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 beep. And that would be a unique tag for each bird. And so that's what ends up happening, is that they have those unique pulse patterns, as well as the time in between those pulse patterns are also unique to give you even more diversity, so that you can have a whole bunch more tags out on the landscape. So that is what makes each tag unique and makes you be able to identify one bird or one animal from the other animal. And so all these arrays are talking to each other. So when, and I'll show you how this works with a diagram, a fun little diagram that my colleague put together. But when those tags pass these towers, they will say, hey, I was detected here, and that will give you a location for that animal. And these towers their range is huge. They can be able to detect 9 miles in each direction. I say 30 kilometers, but it's, if you want to put it in hour units, it's 9 miles in each direction. Darn metric system. It can be really tough going between the two. So 18 miles is pretty big altogether. 18 miles for like a big circle, as a diameter, is huge when you think about wildlife passing through. So all these birds and all these towers are on this big network. Here's a preview of what the tower network looks like so far on this 166.38 frequency. We do have another frequency that's up and coming called 434. It's on the ultra high frequency. That's what you typically use with your when your car communicates with your garage. That's the frequency that you're using. It's the ultra high frequency. Super geeking out. It's really interesting to see, just like there are a bunch of radio frequencies passing by your head at all times. It's hard to see it, but it happens. And so this is what you're seeing right now. It's just these birds are passing by and sending off frequencies all the time. So we have a lot of stations all working together to hopefully listen to animals passing by. And so what it looks like overall is, let's say we have this Swainson's thrush that's been tagged. A bander went off and tagged it with all the appropriate permits and done so ethically. So this bird is good to go, safe and ready to fly by and show exactly where it goes for its migratory path. So that bird will then, here's another diagram of that bird now, turned into more of a blob, I suppose, to show you that it flies by this tower. And let's say this is, again, 9 miles in each direction. That bird will go, fly by, and then it will be picked up by the tower, and that tower hopefully will be connected to our internet, so that online you have this big database to actually say, oh, this bird, this tag just went by this tower, and then we can map it out. So here it is again, but kind of if you were to go out, kind of at a bigger scale, kind of be able to scale out and see exactly what happens when it passes each tower instead of just one like the previous slide. So this is the bird officially being tagged, and then it going on along its journey, getting picked up by one tower, another tower, and then another tower. And you can see this gives you a relative idea as to where that bird ended up migrating to. So that's the idea. And you might be thinking, so what happens all in between those points? We don't know. So there are definitely gaps in our knowledge about what happens, but we're hoping that we can continue to be able to add more towers throughout all these gaps so that we can refine those migratory pathways as we continue to tag animals. So again, why does that really contribute to migration? Why do we even need to know where they're going? Well, again, it's all about conservation. Ultimately, it's about knowing where they go, knowing when they go, because especially when you think about things like, the weather changing over time, winter's getting warmer, that affects migration. And when those animals are leaving overall, it might delay migration, it might speed it up. Oftentimes we expect it to delay. So they might be taking, they might be spending more time on their breeding grounds before they leave to go migrate to their wintering grounds. And so we can learn about that with this technology. We can also learn about those specific stopover sites to see whether, one species, whether a population might actually be all convening to one location. That can be really powerful when you think about it, because if a whole species and all of them convene to one location, that makes them easy to conserve, but also very vulnerable if something negative happens there, such as if the things that they depend upon, like let's say large swaths of wetlands, all of a sudden get drained. That's a problem, but we can at least identify that that's going on and help to preserve those spaces. And that's the same with wintering grounds. Same idea. If they're all going to those same locations, we can go in there and say, okay, we know this is a major wintering hotspot for this species. Let's see what's going on, and let's see if we can protect those areas. So it really helps us to target our habitat conservation work. So now I talked a lot about the Motus network and what it's all about. And it's amazing because you can, if you were a, let's say somebody like a zoo or a nonprofit that wanted to contribute to research, like you can really help contribute to that by just putting up one tower and helping fill in a gap. And that, it not only contributes to just one project, it contributes to like a whole network of projects, often 200 or more projects, just by adding up a tower in these gaps. So it can be rather powerful, and that a lot of it is done through the goodness of other organizations putting on their own money into it. So it's very much, I like to say, grassroots, because all these different parties are putting in their own resources to help develop out that network. And that's the beauty of Motus. Motus is just that it's really just a very collaborative, very like selfless type of program that helps to really push the envelope on how animals are migrating, which is really important to know, especially in a rapidly changing and developing world. So with wood thrush, you might be thinking, okay, I was going to talk about wood thrush, but why did we even choose wood thrush in the first place? Well, first and foremost, we specifically wanted to work on a species that needed conservation. And so wood thrush are a perfect example of that. They've declined 59%. More than 50% of its population has disappeared since 1970. That's a lot. Just imagine the human population just splitting in half over that period of time. It's really hard to think that would be a lot of people lost. So think about that in terms of wood thrush. They're also listed as a conservation concern in a lot of states, 25, and they're also listed nationally as a species that's in decline. But they're still common, which makes it powerful because you can get a lot of birds to be tagged. And you need to really understand how a species is doing, you need to have a lot of data. And so that's why it can be really helpful to have like populations that are not doing so bad, so that you're not tagging every individual left in that population and thus weakening them. That might actually end up being more of a threat to a really endangered population. So it's good to have like something that's still very abundant. And they're also pretty good species to work with in terms of just handling like logistical aspects of them. They fit in the palm of a hand, which is really nice, because when they're a lot bigger, they can be really hard to manage. And if they have a really thick, pointy, dangerous bill, they can be really hard to manage as well, because some birds actually lead to bleeding, especially cardinals, for example. Northern cardinals are seed eaters. They have super thick bills, and when they bite onto you, they don't let go. And so wood thrush are not like that. They're insectivores. They don't have to crack through a really hard case to get into the seed. So they're a little bit easier to manage. They're not going to cause you to bleed, hopefully not as much as a cardinal would. So that's why we chose wood thrush. And so there was this pilot study that was done in 2022 through the Missouri's Wildlife Agency, where they work with a nonprofit to specifically tag wood thrush on their wintering grounds, because they were interested for all those reasons that I mentioned on the last slide as to like, why are they declining in the first place? They're still abundant. Let's figure out why. So they deployed 23 tags on wood thrush in Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And here are the tracks that they received overall. You can see here spring migration occurred here on those darker green pathways, whereas fall migration occurred here on those lighter kind of yellow highlighted pathways. So it was really interesting to see during spring migration. So you have to imagine they were tagged on their wintering grounds here. So these birds were picked up on showing several paths on other Motus towers throughout the network. And you can see a lot more paths were delineated. There are 8 paths that were delineated altogether. And that's because not all the birds survive. Migration is a really, it's a dangerous and very risky part of their lives. I would say probably one of the most risky, even like pretty much akin to like post right after they fledge when they're really young and naive. It's a really dangerous part of their lives. They have to face all kinds of things like new predators. There are new environments, bad weather, hurricanes, and imagine not having anything to protect you when you're flying. There's nothing there. You're just exposed to the elements. So that's what they have to face. And then they have to face hitting into buildings. There are things, they get really thrown off course when there are a lot of lights around. So cities can be really hard for them to navigate through. So not all of them will survive. So only 8 of the 23 that were tagged were able to, show their unique pathways. And they might have had more that survived, but some of them might have not actually hit some of these towers because the network wasn't as well developed. So those are some other reasons why we might have not gotten more tags. But it showed here that there was some what we call migratory connectivity, which is where birds in a population will kind of have this fidelity, this loyalty to specific locations along their migratory paths, and they will go to those locations, the same locations, year after year after year. And so they're rather predictable, which is really nice. And when you have populations that are convening to the same locations and doing it again and again and again, that has a lot of power because you can conserve those locations. So you can see here again the 8 paths here, and then they had 3 paths for fall migration, which was really nice because these tags lasted for, I think, about 400 days. They show the paths of 3 birds that were able to survive throughout a full year, basically. And those birds showed really strong wintering site fidelity, meaning they went back to the same exact location on their wintering grounds. They're like, this is my winter home. I'm not just going to go around and like wander and see what's up and like, instead of going to Costa Rica, I'm going to go to Mexico. They didn't do that. They're like, I like Costa Rica. This is my place. I'm going to stay here. Puerto Rico. This is great. I love it. So they chose to go back. And that's really nice to know because that means that it's likely that, if you get more and you learn more about, get more tagged birds and you learn more that they like that location, you can conserve it. You can protect those habitats. I just wanted to specifically focus in on one of the birds that was tagged. Here's the migratory pathway of one wood thrush that was tagged in Costa Rica in 2022 that went from Costa Rica to around Washington, D.C. over here, and then to around Allentown, PA, Pennsylvania, and then made the southward journey again back to Pennsylvania, but near Philadelphia, and then around the southern tip of Maryland, but back right to the same exact location. So that I just wanted to focus in on that one because the other side kind of had everybody in there, but at least this would drive home the point that some of the birds had some really strong site fidelity to the wintering grounds, meaning they went back to the same location. So now, kind of putting things more into perspective, what I'm going to talk to you about is, we talked about why did we choose wood thrush? And it was for a lot of reasons specifically related to conservation and that the fact that we had people pilot that work. So we got some interesting data. And so we, at that point, Sarah Kendrick, she was the one who really was like, this was her brainchild. She was the one who developed it. She wanted to actually see what would happen if we were to actually tag a lot more wood thrush across its entire range and get all this data on this bird. And so this led to a much greater project called the range-wide Motus tracking of wood thrush to inform conservation across the full annual cycle. And it was to deploy these tags, 600 of them throughout the entire range of wood thrush for a whole species, which is, it's a lot to think about. There are a lot of people who were involved in this, but she made it happen and we were helping there. We were part of it. The Indiana DNR with all of its partners were there to help to make this become a reality. So what ended up happening was that 26 states joined to help deploy these tags. And I'll give you some results on what actually happened in terms of like what tags were deployed, which states were involved. And Ontario also got involved too, because they have some wood thrush in there too. So Indiana, specifically, our role in all of this was to help fill in the gap for Indiana and see where Indiana wood thrush go. And that's what I'm going to tell you specifically about. Where did our Indiana wood thrush go? So to be able to do this, to actually tag our wood thrush, we wanted, or rather we needed tags. This didn't just come out, they didn't just give it to us, which would have been nice, but this was, again, a very much an organic project that a lot of people, it's kind of like thinking of crowdsourcing. I think a lot of people got involved, used their own resources to help make this become a reality. And so Indiana worked with the Indiana Audubon Society to raise money for being able to buy these wood thrush tags. We bought 26 for deploying across the state of Indiana, and here are the costs. About each tag was about $260, and then raised about $18,000, $18,500. That included contracting, actually paying the people who were deploying these tags to be successful in making this project, in actually being able to get these tags out on the landscape. And so in addition to Indiana Audubon Society helping with that fundraising effort called the Chasing Melody Project, we also partnered with IU Kokomo, Indiana University Kokomo's Lena Riffai, and Sycamore Land Trust was also there to help us. Their interns were there, and we also deployed some tags on their properties too. So it was a big collaborative project, which was fun to do. Got to meet a lot of people and work with them. It's really great. And once we got the money, we're like, okay, we're officially committed. We bought the tags. We were like, okay, this is real. Now we have to do it. But you have to do it, meaning you actually have to know what to do. So I've done a lot of bird tagging in my past. I never worked with Motus tags, so I wanted to get a refresher on how to do that. And so we had a training that was organized by Sarah Kendrick from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's a migratory bird biologist there. She organized this with Kentucky Division of Fish and Wildlife and had partners from all over the region of the wood thrush species range come to learn on how to tag wood thrush and how to work all these new technologies. So I wanted to show you a video of how they did that. And so if you see here, let's see.
Loop over the robin's right foot. This is how I always do it.
You can see the harness being put on American robin.
I always do right foot
with a tag.
And I'm feeding it over. And then as soon as it's on that leg, I'm trying to tuck it up into the bird's thigh. And if they're kicking or anything, I let that kicking kind of help the tag tuck into, right against the bird's body and against their thigh. And you can see that it's tightly positioned in there, and then
So you can see other people are standing around the table watching. I was taking video just to see how this works so I can really study and remember it. But if you notice, there's a harness that we put on the bird, and it's got the tag attached to it, and we use beading material called Stretch Magic. So if you ever made jewelry, you might be familiar with this. It's just a really stretchy type of wiring that's plastic that uses crimp beads to help them, instead of glue, to help them have everything stay in place. And so that tag is attached to this harness that we made out of Stretch Magic, and it's put around their hips. So it goes up and over the thigh, kind of like I think of climbing gear. If you've ever done any climbing, like rock climbing, you have that gear and it goes kind of like up and around the legs. And then you have the tag kind of above, I'd say, above the lower back, the small of your back. And that's where it would be placed on the bird. It would be above the tail, above that uropygial gland, which is where, if you know more about birds, that's where when they preen their feathers, there's an oil that comes out of their gland that they use to help keep their feathers smooth and not dried out. It moisturizes them and allows the feathers to really like get interlocked with each other, which allows them to fly. And that is right below the tag. So we want to avoid that uropygial gland as much as possible, because you'd be interfering with that process of them being able to preen themselves. So that tag is put on there, and it doesn't, if you notice, again, it's with the legs, so it doesn't interfere with their wings. And that's very key, because these birds are often in flight, and during migration, they're on the wing. You don't want to interfere with that process. So we went to this training in Kentucky with all of our partners, and they pretty much taught us how to do this on all different types of birds. And the reason why we were choosing multiple types of birds was because our harness was made to custom fit every bird. Every bird, just like every human, is not the same size. We are not that way. I had some really chunky females at one point that were 10 grams bigger than another, like a male. It was itty bitty little male. And you're not going to put the same exact harness type on both of those birds because it's going to fall off. You know, it's going to fall off the male if you made it for the female, who was a lot bigger. So we wanted to make them specifically custom fit to every bird. And that's why we were training on all different birds of all different sizes. So once we learned how to actually harness these birds with these tags, we had to go in and say, okay, now we actually have to capture them. And we did do a little bit of training on it, but a lot of the learning actually occurred in the field. We were given some guidance, and we learned the best thing to do is to lure birds in to a net called a mist net. That's really fine mesh that has these little pockets in them where the bird will bounce into the net and then go into the pocket and kind of get tangled up into that pocket. And so the birds, we had to lure them into the mist nets to be able to do this. And the way that we were able to lure them was by using decoys here. So you can see this decoy here with a lot of poison ivy around. Some brave person put it in the middle of this poison ivy. And we had this decoy, which was just surprisingly a pigeon decoy that was painted by my lovely intermaid Grace. She's a very good artist. If you're into conservation as an artist, you can totally run wild with that and be successful, because we need people who are very good at being able to paint. So she painted these to look like wood thrush, and they were surprisingly tricked by them. We actually had one that was big and one that was small. Some of them went for the bigger ones, and some of them went for the smaller ones. All these birds are different, so we had to have a variety. And we also lured them into the net, not only using multiple decoys to look like territorial males. Males, especially when they're breeding, will be very territorial. They'll defend their territories tooth and nail, tooth and talon, so to speak, claw, and beak and claw, and they will fly at the bird and try to attack them. And so that's what the decoy was used to kind of really get that bird to respond well to those calls and go into the net. And we also had playbacks of wood thrush territorial calls, and you can hear them one here. So when you're listening to this call, you'll hear a really faint one. That's actually our audio recording that's calling in the background. And then you'll hear a really loud one, and that one is the actual wood thrush, a live wood thrush responding to the one that was recorded. So listen carefully, listen closely. Yeah, that's when you really hear it. It's like, ah! That's the real wood thrush calling back. And when you have these visual and auditory aspects working together, it made it look like there was a live wood thrush in the territory of this wood thrush. So that male would hopefully go in and try to attack that other one, but again get stuck in the net. And you can see the net here. I don't know if you see that, it's hiding, but here's the net, here's a pole, and here's another pole, and then we have some lines to help it be stable. And here is my internet, who's now a private lands biologist, Jillian Martin. She is extracting or taking out a wood thrush from the mist net. So once we got him in our hand, we actually have to put the tag on the bird by using that harnessing method. And I have some video here as well. So I just wanted to show you what that looked like. An actual wood thrush. And you could see us putting what Jillian's doing with her hands. I'm holding the wood thrush. Jillian is moving a bead. That's the crimp bead. You can see it's shiny. She's moving it up to tighten it a little bit around those legs so it's not too loose. If it's too loose, it interferes with their ability to walk, and we don't want that. We want it to be nice and snug. And then I will constantly check. I will blow at their feathers to check where the wire is in between the legs. So I will constantly check and then look at it, check until we've gotten in the right position, and then we'll actually crimp it so that it's permanently in that place. So, so that's what ultimately ends up looking like, is this little tag with a long transmitter at the end of it. And that transmitter, the length of it's really important, because the longer it is, the more it can actually send out a signal to those towers to communicate with them. So that's how you tag a wood thrush. That's the whole process of what happens when you attract them, capture them, and then tag them, and then release them. So we ended up doing a really good job, surprisingly in Indiana. We were able to get all of our tags out, but before talking about that specifically, I wanted to let you know how the nation did. Everybody collectively were able to deploy 560 tags throughout the 26 states, 25 states and 1 province, Ontario. So these are all the different states that were involved, and here are all the different stars of where they were. It was a really great partnership between everybody. And in Indiana, we were able to deploy all 26 tags at these locations here. And we really wanted to do all these different locations because we were wondering, like, do wood thrush in northern Indiana have a different path than wood thrush in southern Indiana? That might be the case. We don't know enough about them. We've never studied their migratory pathways, but that difference in latitude might be significant to lead to, like, one might go to Mexico, whereas the other one might go to Costa Rica. So we wanted to get as much geographic variation in our tagged birds as possible. And here is an actual release of a wood thrush in slow motion. This is Wyatt Downey. He was one of our the intermins at Sycamore Land Trust that helped us to find bird nests and help find wood thrush so that we could actually be successful in our tagging. I really like this video because it shows you the bird kicking its legs, showing that the harness is not interfering with its legs. So you can see legs were kicking, which was great because it's like, oh, the harness is fitting properly, and then it flies off. And then they'll sit on a branch and be like, oh, how dare you touch me? And be like, I'm sorry. Thank you for taking one for the team. And surprisingly, I'll let you know about what happened to those birds. So we were able to deploy all 26 tags in those locations, and we luckily were able to get a lot of information on our wood thrush. Like you saw in that last one, in the pilot study, they were only able to get 8 tracks for wood thrush. We're able to do pretty darn well in Indiana. So where are Indiana birds right now? Well, so we ended up actually having one bird that was tagged near Mount Tabor. She was one of our first birds we ever tagged. This is a female. This is actually her, and this is her track. We had her banded, tagged on a Sycamore Land Trust property, one of our partners. She flew to Georgia on the night of October 14th. She was a super fast flyer. She actually flew 45 miles per hour for part of her journey to get her to Tennessee, and then she flew around 35 miles per hour on average to get to Georgia. So definite all-star. I was really excited to see that. And she did this all in one night. She went from Indiana to Georgia in one night. Very cool to see that. And then we had another bird. There were actually 2 birds that I ended up tagging, one at Kent Farm near Indiana University, and one at Hovey Lake near Evansville, one of our Fish and Wildlife area properties. And they both ended up in Veracruz, Mexico. That was awesome. I was really excited to see our birds go to Mexico. I'm like, you survived. What a great relief, because I was worried that, you know, you tag birds, you don't know what happens to them. We were able to get immediate results. Like, once migration started, they popped up on those towers, and there were actually a lot of wood thrush that went through Veracruz, Mexico, throughout a lot of the Midwest. So there might be some interesting migratory connectivity occurring through Mexico. I'm kind of interested in seeing where that goes. And And so another one of our partners was Eve Cusack. She is a MAPS bander, Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Program bander that works with Indiana University as a volunteer for her banding station. And then we had another bird at Heavy Lake. So this is just to show a little bit closer about that bird that went to Mexico. That bird was tagged in the summer and then showed up at in Veracruz, Mexico on October 18th. So they were, it seemed like a lot of them made a lot of their traveling in October, like early October to mid-October. And then we had a few other birds that went through, kind of like they went a lot to, I want to say Georgia was a major stopover area for our birds. There specifically was one that was banded near Martell Forest, and that's, I think, near Purdue. Those birds ended up going to Georgia or Chattanooga, Tennessee. And then there, actually, we had 3 of them that ended up flying within a few miles of each other. They're all getting picked up at the same time on that same tower, which was really cool. And then we had several of the birds ending up in Mississippi. And another bird, there was one that was banded at Jasper Pulaski Fish and Wildlife area in northwestern Indiana. That's where all the sandhill cranes like to gather during the fall and the winter. That bird ended up in Texas, in the along the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the area right here of where this bird was tagged here, ended up showing up on a Heavy Lake on the tower over there, and then disappeared for a while, but then ended up showing up in Texas. So he was just kind of AWOL for a little bit and then came back, which was nice. So we were actually able to confirm that he was alive and well in Texas. So what do we end up, what will we actually end up doing with all this information? What are our next steps going to be? Well, there actually is going to be a second year for this project. We're hoping to deploy another 25 tags, which have been, surprisingly, it's been funded, so it's going to happen. We had some really good partners raise those monies, and we will hopefully anxiously await our wood thrush to come back to Indiana during their spring migration. And I'm rooting for them. I'm hoping that a lot of them survived. So that's what we're hoping to do in the next few months, next year. And again, I just wanted to really ground this in, like, why are we doing this? What's the whole point? It's for conservation. It's really about learning about where these birds go so that we can protect them throughout their full annual cycles, throughout their full lives. And, you know, once we really figure out, like, are there specific areas that are being shared by wood thrush all of the Midwest term population? Well, that might be something worth putting effort towards to protect. So that's what we're hoping to do. And this will really help us improve our ability to target our conservation work. And we also hope to really grow our Motus network over time as this project continues, so that we can fill in those little gaps, those gaps where we're like, oh, bird from Jasper Pulaski disappeared for a little bit. Hopefully, if we fill in the gap, we can reappear during his spring migration. And I wanted to really mention that, like, a lot of this work was helped out by, for at least for my time, the Indiana Non-Game Wildlife Fund. It is our matching source, which is money that provides evidence to show, like, that the public of Indiana is really interested in wildlife work, and specifically in protecting endangered and declining species. And that allows us to get federal money from the government so that we can actually do the good work that we're doing. So this is actually really necessary for us to get the federal money. We have to provide evidence, and that comes through your donations. And this has helped us for a very long time do things like recover peregrine falcons. They're still listed, but they're getting to the point where, you know, their populations are stabilizing. Our work is really supported by the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. And if you want to tune in into what we're doing, you can find out more about it through our Non-Game Wildlife Fund e-newsletter. Just go online and check it out and see all the different work that we're, you know, all the really cool stuff we're doing. It's not just birds, it's like francolins, ground squirrels, and hellbenders, and all kinds of fun stuff. So I hope you tune into that. But I wanted to thank everybody for for taking the time out of your busy holiday seasons to come and join me and learn a little bit about Motus. All right. If you have any questions, let me know.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Allie. I really appreciate it. I am going to go ahead and I've popped some resources in the chat here for folks. So if anybody wants to look up some of these organizations or projects that you've talked about, they can do so. We do have a question here. So Allie, can you tell us a little bit about will the bird carry the Motus tag for the rest of its life, or will it eventually drop off? So I don't know exactly what the lifespan really is of the wood thrush. I know you said the tag usually lasts about a year, I think you said. So can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So the tag likely will stay on that bird for the rest of its life. And even though it's made out of stretch magic, which does deteriorate over time, it needs a lot of exposure to light to be able to get like brittle and deteriorate. So when it's under a bird's feathers, it usually isn't exposed to that much environmental pressures. It doesn't have like a lot of things really wearing it away other than the bird. So so we do expect it to be on the bird for the rest of its life. And these wood thrush typically live for around, like, on average, I'd say like 3 to 4 years, give or take. They're not very long-lived species, but so ultimately we do expect like the birds to just have it on. Again, like, we are using our best practices. Everybody who does ban these birds, tag them, they have to have a permit. They have to have the permission from the federal government to do this. They have to have a banning permit, and then they have special authorization to put tags on. And they have to be working with a group, and that the organization that governs us on all of that, like, make sure that we're all working together and communicating instead of like doing our own thing and not making sure that we're being ethical. There are specifically rules in place to ensure that that bird isn't being burdened completely by this tag. So it can't be more than 3% of the wood thrush's weight. So when I think about like a 100-pound person, it can only be 3 pounds, pretty much. That's like, just compare that. So 3 pounds, a fanny pack with 3 pounds in it, having that on you for the rest of your life. If you're 100 pounds, I sometimes think my shoes and my clothes that I wear every day probably weigh about that much. So just, I feel like it's about the amount of weight that one would imagine, like, just wearing every day.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Allie. I appreciate that. That's really good context to have, and good to know that, you know, there are ethical guidelines and best practices for all of these species and projects that are happening to make sure the critters who are taking one for the team, like you said, and carrying around that fanny pack aren't overburdened, and it's not going to really impact their ability to survive in the wild. So I also wanted to know, can you tell us a little bit about, like, are there any species that you can think of that you're really particularly excited for Motus to help out with? So obviously the wood thrush, because that's underway, but are there other species in need of conservation in Indiana that you think having this data could really have a positive impact on the species?
Yeah, we've actually been thinking a lot about loggerhead shrikes. Loggerhead shrikes, like I said before, well, we only have about 10 pairs that we know of throughout the state of Indiana. So that, imagine like 10 married couples throughout the state of Indiana, and that's all there is. Nobody else. It's really hard to find each other. Like, I can't imagine, and all you have to do is, you can only walk to each other. It would be really, really hard. So they're not doing that great, and it's hard for them to find each other. And they suffer from a lot of different threats, such as getting hit by cars. They often are exposed to like rapid environmental changes, like a lot of developments are occurring in their areas where they inhabit. So they are a species that we really want to know more about, especially in terms of where the birds go right after they fledge from the nest. They just disappear, and we're like, are they dead? Or did they just go somewhere else? And it'd be really nice if we could tag them to see, and actually like follow them around with an antenna to see where they're ending up, because they just disappear and we just assume they're dead. That's like our like default responses, like they must be dead, but they might not, and we just might not be looking in the right places. The only thing with shrikes is that they're called the butcher bird for a reason. They like to mess with things. So the antennas on the tags and the tags themselves they might be pretty hard to figure out like what might be a good fit for them, because I've heard of them tearing off their antennas because they don't like them, you know. Who wants to have this thing sticking out of your tail? So they do mess with them, but we're thinking there might be another modified way, and that information is so valuable for us to know so that we could help them. That's why we're doing this, is to help them. So I'm hoping that we can figure out a way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Allie. That's really helpful. I hope that ends up working out for shrikes and that they, we're able to find a way for them to tolerate that. We have one more really quick question, and then we're going to end off because we're at our time here. So this person asks, when you deploy tags in 2025 for kind of phase 2 of the project, will you attempt to recapture the birds that currently have tags if they have survived the return trip, or will you try to find different individuals from different areas in the state?
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. I think what we'll do is, I actually have been wanting to, it would be nice to tag in the same locations, to be able, because we're familiar with those areas, and if we do find the birds again, that gives us the opportunity to actually take it off them. If they do, again, fall for our tricks. That's the hard part. Birds are smart. Whenever somebody calls you a bird brain, don't take that as a somebody like messing with you. Actually, take that as a compliment. Birds are really smart. Like, surprisingly, they know and they recognize those things. When they've been caught once, it is really hard to capture them again. Like, they have to be, they have to have no memory of what happened to them the first time. So, and that's often not the case. So if we can capture them again, it would be really nice to take off those tags and put them on somebody else. Yeah, just like really seeing if there's some strong site fidelity. So if the birds in southern Indiana ended up going to those same exact spots again, it might be showing you that migratory connectivity, that they're really linked up to specific locations and very faithful to those locations along their pathways. So I'm hoping to.
Awesome. Excellent, Allie. I really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you so much for being on here and sharing all of your expertise. And I cannot wait to hear the results from this particular project that you're working on, and the results from year 2, just to kind of see how these critters are doing. So thank you so much. And thank you so much to everybody in the audience as well who has taken their time this evening to learn a little bit about the Motus Network and the Wood Thrush project that's going on. I put these in the chat, but please feel free to check out our Non-Game Wildlife Fund page just to learn a little bit more about the projects that are going on here at the DNR for rare and endangered critters. And feel free to subscribe to our newsletter as well. I put Allie's email in there. And as I mentioned, we will be sending out a post event email within the next few days, just with some answers to questions and all of these resources for people to reference. And then within the next few weeks, this recording will go on YouTube. So if you know somebody who wanted to attend and maybe had a conflict, they will still get a chance to learn about all of this wonderful information. So thank you so much, Allie, and thank you, Alexandra, for being on here as well. And thank you to the audience, and have a great evening.
Thank you.